The previous videos, we talked about how government taxation would impact individual consumers. And then ultimately from our first section, we know that we can sum up the behavior of individual consumers for market demand. And then we talked about how taxation would impact the decisions of individual producers. And we also know that the sum of the individual producers creates market supply. Right. So now we're in the position to kind of discuss when do we or do we not want government intervention into markets? And we'll address this question by talking again about the individual types of market structures, which we studied in the course, starting with perfect competition. Right. So just to recap, because I don't think I have the picture here before we start. When we talked about monopolies, we did a little bit of an exercise where we argued graphically that the perfect competitor was the economically efficient, we called it, model because it maximized the total area of producer and consumer surplus and created no deadweight loss. And then we did a mathematical exercise where we found, okay, what happens if the market is monopolized? Well, P goes up, Q goes down. So we can find that the consumers are worse off in terms of consumer surplus, and we can actually calculate that consumer surplus loss. So the question is, do we want government to intervene and make producers behave more competitively? So let's just kind of get into what will happen in markets in general, starting with the perfectly competitive market if the government implements a tax. And then we'll again talk about more when do or don't we want the government to do this. So, the free market argument, Adam Smith's invisible hand, is that governments should not intervene in competitive markets because they maximize total surplus. And we'll make an argument here that eventually we have what we call market failures. And when we have market failures, the perfectly competitive market does not maximize total surplus, and the government could be able to intervene in a welfare improving way. Right, so just sort of in general to work up to that, what will happen if the government implements a tax? The following pictures just show what happens on the end. We sort of built this up in the previous sections, but now we're just looking at the linear market case where everybody is summed up, and we're going to assume that the sum of everybody is linear. So what happens if you tax demand? Well, from the individual consumer's perspective, one of two things will happen. Either you're taxing income and that reduced the consumer's optimum bundle, how much of the good they were consuming at each price, or you tax an individual good, and there it depends on whether it's the good being taxed, but assume that this is the good being taxed, then the demand for the taxed good should decrease because it's relatively more expensive. Right, so that's what we're seeing here, regardless of whether you tax income. If you remember back to 202 or the original discussions about what is demand and the demand shift factors, but consumer income is a demand shift factor. So shift income and this shifts, you tax the product. Here you've got demand shifting by the amount of the tax. Same deal for supply. You implement a tax in a market, supply will decrease by the amount of the tax, and we built that up with the marginal cost argument in the previous video. So coming up, we'll take a look at when we might want to tax supply or demand, or, in general, I guess, keep in mind the argument for non-intervention is competitive markets have no deadweight loss, and government intervention might create deadweight loss. So the general argument, economically speaking, against market intervention from the government is maximizing producer plus consumer surplus. And we'll talk about cases when we, again, have market failures that cause that not to be the case. So for now, we're going to argue that actually the choice of who we tax, whether we actually place the tax on consumers and consumers have to pay the ticket value of the tax, or whether we put it on producers, it actually doesn't matter, which is kind of counterintuitive. So why doesn't it matter whether we tax consumers or suppliers in general? It turns out it only depends on the relative elasticities of supply and demand. Right, so consider a market with the tax on supply. Before the tax, we're at equilibrium here, supply equals demand. Here's the price where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So this is our original equilibrium and it's unmarked. All right. We put a tax on suppliers, so it shifts the supply to the left. And what this is going to do now is consumers are going to pay the intersection of the tax supply and their demand. And the government is going to collect the difference as tax, right? We said already that the distance between the two marginal cost curves, or in other words, the distance between the two supply curves for the competitor, is the amount of the tax. So here's the amount of the tax. And then this is the price that the producers receive, which was their original willingness to provide this quantity. All right, remember, you can kind of think about the supply curve as the producers or the markets, the price at which they will provide this quantity. Right, distance is the tax. So what are we seeing here? It looks like it's kind of, we'll talk about the ticket cost of the tax, or who actually has to pay the tax up front, and we'll talk about the economic burden of the tax. What the economic burden of the tax means is who on the back end has to pay the difference in prices. So right now we're looking at something that looks to be kind of equally split, right? Here was the old price. Without the tax, it was the same for both producer and consumer. It was right here. And with the tax, the consumers pay a little bit more, the producers receive a little bit less, and the difference is the amount of the tax. So again, in this picture, it looks like it's kind of split pretty evenly, right? The price increase for the consumer looks to be about the same as the price decrease for the producer. All right, and again, what I'm going to argue here is that it doesn't matter who you tax, whether this tax is on supply or demand. It only depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. Just a couple of notes to clean up this picture. We can see the area of government revenue, which is shaded in here. We said this is the amount of the tax, or the difference between the two marginal cost or supply curves is the amount of the tax times the quantity. So there's our area of government revenue. There's also a triangle of deadweight loss created. So here, remember, any time that we have a quantity lower than the market quantity, and it turns out later we'll see if we have a quantity higher than the equilibrium quantity, there is deadweight loss created, which is this area right here, because now there's a lower than market equilibrium quantity created. Right? In other words, these consumers right here would have liked to be able to purchase at this original market price, but now in the taxed market, they're unwilling or unable to pay. Right, so again, in the previous example, it looks graphically like the consumers split the burden equally. So here's an example where demand is actually perfectly inelastic. And again, we're trying to prove basically graphically that regardless of whether the tax is on producers or consumers, the economic burden of the tax will be borne according to elasticity. So imagine a market with a perfectly inelastic demand, like the market for insulin for diabetics. Right? In general, diabetics need about a certain amount of insulin each day, so their demand is perfectly inelastic. All right, so here we have an inelastic demand, we have original supply, and here's our original market price. So suppose you put the tax on suppliers. Here's the supply shift. All right, our new consumer price is going to be the intersection of demand and the new tax supply right here. Producers will receive that new consumer price minus the tax right here, the distance between the two curves. There's our producer price. And here's the market quantity. So in this case, the market quantity hasn't changed. The market is still providing this quantity right here because the consumers need it to stay alive. However, the entire burden, ultimately, the entire economic burden or the entire price change is borne by the consumers, right? We shifted supply. Here's the new consumer price. And it turns out the new producer price is exactly the same as what the old producer price would have been. And this would have been the old consumer price, but now with the tax, consumers are paying more. All right, what about if instead put the tax on demand? Well, if you have a perfectly inelastic demand curve, they still need this quantity regardless of the tax. So it doesn't actually move it at all. You could think of it, it's moving like down, but it's just a line which extends all the way here. So the tax on demand, and if demand is perfectly inelastic, won't shift demand. They still need that amount to stay alive. All right, suppliers are going to receive the intersection of the new demand, which is the same as the old one, in their supply. That's right here. And that line was supposed to connect. Maybe it moved when I uploaded this. Right, producers receive this point right here, which is the same as before, supposed to be. Right, consumers then pay the amount of the tax because now it's a tax on demand, so the consumers have to pay it. Their consumer price is higher by the amount of the tax, which is the exact same as they paid before. Right, in the example problems for this chapter, I'll post a couple more where demand or supply is not perfectly inelastic, and we'll see that the result still holds. In this case, if demand is perfectly inelastic, consumers pay the entire economic cost of the tax. But in general, the economic burden will be split according to elasticity. Whoever is relatively more inelastic will pay relatively more of the price difference. Right? Here we showed that both cases, tax on supply and tax on demand, both result in consumer paying the entire economic cost because the consumers are inelastic. Right, so in general, I haven't shown the example of inelastic supply. It's hard to think of examples in the real world of a supplier only being willing to set a certain quantity no matter what. So one example of an inelastic supply might actually be a labor market where people are the suppliers of labor and firms are the consumers or demanders of labor. If you require work to survive, then you have a fixed quantity of work you're supplying no matter what. And so there's kind of a section in the notes which talks about that. I haven't really talked much about labor markets here, but it's also an interesting study which would come up in like a 425 class or something similar. All right, in the next video, we'll talk about externalities, which are a case where we might want government intervention in markets.